Hello, everyone. Welcome to Between the Columns. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. If you're in Charlottesville, you know it's really rainy, so thank you so much for being here. My name is Maggie Walsh. I'm the Director of Events for the College Foundation here at UVA. I'm a proud alum of the class of 2011 with the college, and we're really excited to welcome our speaker here today to discuss this timely topic. Brad Wilcox is a 1992 graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences. He studied at UVA as a Jefferson Scholar and later earned his PhD from Princeton University. He is Professor of Sociology and Director of the National Marriage Project at UVA. He's also a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And Professor Wilcox's research focuses on marriage, fatherhood, and family life in the United States. Moderating today's discussion are two alums, and we're really excited to have them here today. We have Chantel White and VJ Menon. Chantel White is a school counselor at Colgan High School in Manassas, Virginia. And she is a double who. In May of 2019, she graduated from UVA with her MED in counselor education. In 2017, she also earned her Bachelor of Science in Education in Youth and Social Innovation and Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from UVA. She is passionate about mentoring young women and promoting equity and access through counseling for students of color. VJ Menon is a policy advisor on the US Congress Joint Economic Committee, where he researches and writes on domestic policy issues for Chairman Mike Lee's Social Capital Project. Previously, he served as a research assistant at the Heritage Foundation and to Professor Wilcox. He's a native of Falls Church, Virginia, and he's also a double who, having completed economics and government majors in the college and the accelerated Master of Public Program Policy in the Batten School. So after our moderators get things started, Professor Wilcox will share a presentation about the topic at hand today, and they will have a discussion about that. And VJ and Chantel will also refer to a few of the questions that were submitted when you all registered. And then we will take your questions after that in using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And just depending on how much time we have, we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chantel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maggie. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you all for having me. I just wanted to speak a little bit about my experience with Dr. Wilcox. So back in 2016, I was an undergrad student. I actually had the opportunity to take Sociology of the Family and Family Policy with Dr. Wilcox. As I was recounting on these experiences for myself, I can remember that in these courses, we learned about how culture and policy and family structure impact the livelihood of the family. I always felt that these courses were incredibly relevant and impactful to my own life, and often found myself evaluating how my family structure impacted the way in which I was raised, right, and brought up. So I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity that I had to be involved in those classes. I'm really thankful to be invited back here today. Also, one thing that I remember about Dr. Wilcox, he managed to make it as personable as possible. I remember even being invited to have a class in his home. Unfortunately, the students won't have the opportunity to do that this year, but that was just incredibly impactful and really brought the whole experience full circle. So thank you, Dr. Wilcox. I'm going to pass it over to VJ to share a little bit of background as well.
Hey, thanks, Chantel, and thank you to the college for hosting this event. Before we begin my brief comments, I'm obliged to say that I'm here in my personal capacity, and nothing I say necessarily reflects the views of the Joint Economic Committee, Senator Lee, or anyone else. But like Chantel, I've had the pleasure of taking a class with Professor Wilcox at UVA. But not only that, as Maggie mentioned, I had the privilege of doing research for Professor Wilcox for 2 years while I was a student. And if I didn't believe in the importance of marriage and family life before those experiences, I sure did afterwards. To badly paraphrase The Lion King, everything the family touches is our common concern as citizens. Education, poverty, healthcare, technology, all of these issues and more have a distinct family component. Indeed, many would posit that the family is the fundamental building block of our civil society. Scholars from across the political spectrum have recognized that kids who grow up in or are even surrounded by stable, intact families experience myriad benefits, from lower rates of poverty and abuse to better health to greater upward mobility. Founded in 1997 and moved to the University of Virginia in 2009, the National Marriage Project, directed by Professor Wilcox, aims to give the public a spotlight into the research and trends on contemporary marriage and family life. A key part of its mission is to strengthen marital quality and stability for the sake of kids. And the project works to accomplish this goal by conducting and publishing research, sponsoring conferences, and speaking directly to the public, as is the case with this event today. The project's work reaches a wide audience through good coverage in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and other venues. In fact, you are more likely than not to see Professor Wilcox quoted or the project's work featured in any major American article on the family. So now I'm happy to turn it over to Professor Wilcox, who, with his large family and having recently celebrated his 25th wedding anniversary, might personally know a thing or two about the subject matter at hand today. Professor Wilcox, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks to Maggie and to Chantel and Vijay for that gracious set of introductions. It's good to be with all of you today. And we're talking today about the state of our unions. And I'm going to just pull up my my PowerPoint presentation here to get started with this presentation. So in particular, we're kind of thinking about the good and bad news about marriage in post-COVID America today. And I want to begin by thinking about, why it is that this topic is important. Why is it that marriage matters? And, I have to say that my students at UVA are great. They're curious, hardworking, friendly, and many of them have big hearts for good causes in Charlottesville, from tutoring poor children in city schools to visiting elderly at local nursing homes. But I think they do suffer from one big blind spot. Resume virtues are much more salient for many of my students than our eulogy virtues, to use a set of terms that David Brooks, mentioned earlier in his work. And, this kind of is partly kind of manifested in the fact that sort of talking and thinking about marriage or even dating seriously is a rarity among many of my students at the University of Virginia. Quote, UVA students are definitely more focused on their education, getting their career started, than getting into a serious relationship, said Holly, a recent graduate of UVA. Quote, if it happens, great, but the focus is definitely on building our own brands first. The thought process is relationships and love are a risk, but you will always have your career and success to fall back on, unquote. So this kind of thinking, in this case, articulated by Holly, is not unusual. One recent poll found that 31% of young adults thought that marriage was essential to living a fulfilling life, compared to 64% who thought that education was, and 74% who thought that making a good living was crucial when it comes to fulfillment. So again, the idea for, I think, many young adults, both at UVA and more generally, is that it's all about, that degree. It's all about, the job, the career, the professional path forward, that these are the things that really matter in life today. What many don't understand, don't recognize, don't realize is that when it comes to sort of, meaning, purpose, and happiness in life, is that your relationships are more consequential. That, for instance, when it comes to marital status, what we can see here in this figure is that being married is more powerfully linked to being very happy for the average man and woman in America than is having a higher income or having that college degree. So more concretely, what this shows us is that married Americans are about twice as happy as unmarried Americans, and that sort of the impact of income is smaller, only 48% kind of increase in your odds of being very happy if you've got that higher income, and only 23% increase in your odds of being very happy if you have that college degree. So we can see here that marriage is important, and even more than marriage per se, though, is having a good marriage. Because what the data tell us is that one of the most powerful predictors of being happy in America today is being part of a good marriage. In fact, if you're a part of a good marriage, you're about 5 times more likely to be very happy compared to your fellow citizens who are unmarried. And that sort of this effect of being in a good marriage clearly is more powerful than the effects of income and education. So, these kinds of findings would not be surprising, obviously, to a thinker like Aristotle, who had this, insight that man is by nature a social animal, that our family and our friends are much more important to our long-term welfare than the amount of money that we make or the school that we graduate from. So to kind of bring back David Brooks's terms, the idea here, right, is that it's sort of the eulogy virtues rather than the resume virtues that matter the most in the end. So this is kind of one reason why the state of our unions in America matters for adults. But this Aristotelian point doesn't just apply to adults, it also applies to kids and to communities. Because study after study tells us that our kids are more likely to flourish in school, they're more likely to do well with grades, less likely to end up in the principal's office, and more likely to graduate from a school like UVA when they have the benefit of coming from a stable married parent family, as this figure here on the left suggests. It's also the case, too, that marriage matters, that family matters for the health of the American dream more generally. Work done by the Harvard economist Raj Chetty, for instance, finds that one of the strongest predictors of upward mobility in America is the share of two-parent families in the community. What that means concretely is that kids who are growing up in communities with more two-parent families kind of, in the area are much more likely to experience rags to riches mobility than kids who are surrounded by single-parent families. In fact, this effect holds after controlling for things like, poverty in the neighborhood. So what's clear from the research is that the state of our unions matters not just for adults, but also for kids and for communities. That's why this sort of topic is important today. So, given all this, how is marriage doing in America? Is it in trouble? Is COVID driving a stake through the heart of this most venerable institution in America? And certainly there's evidence, that's been put out there by the media that would lead you to think that marriage is in deep trouble in COVID time. One headline, for instance, from the Daily Mail reported that divorce rates in America soared by 34% during the COVID pandemic. So is that the case? And we can certainly, I think, appreciate how this pandemic has exacted a devastating toll on our families, with thousands upon thousands of Americans dying, especially many of our grandparents, with millions of parents losing their jobs in this year, and with cabin fever making family life difficult, for many of us. And so there are people out there, like a man that I interviewed in Texas, a guy named Dan, who have experienced this pandemic as quite difficult, quite stressful. And in the case of Dan, this pandemic sort of helped tip him over towards divorce court. In his words, my marriage had pre-existing conditions and COVID killed it. So by his account, kind of the stress of being with his wife on a 24/7 basis kind of underlined the fact that from his perspective, this was not a strong partnership. And this recognition, this realization led Dan to seek a divorce in April. And it's certainly the case that many couples are stressed out. According to the American Family Survey, about a third of American couples are seriously stressed by all that's happened here in 2020. And in particular, couples who've seen their financial fortunes decline have been most stressed out by this year, not surprisingly. So again, these are the kinds of things that would, I think, make us expect that divorce is increasing in the US today. But there are also stories out there like Katie's story. Katie is a young wife with a toddler living here in Virginia. And she says that the lockdown was initially stressful for her and for her husband. They were juggling 2 jobs, juggling the care of their toddler, which lost childcare during the pandemic's initial phase. And so, that was obviously initially difficult for them to work through. But they did kind of manage to recalibrate, and things got better. Her husband took on a larger share of childcare. and they figured out their work situation. And probably more importantly, they got opportunities because their commutes had disappeared to spend more time talking with one another and walking as a family around their neighborhood. They also happened to grow in kind of their opportunities to pray together. They're a more religious couple. So in her words, she says this, she says, it may sound strange, but the stay-at-home order and pandemic truly strengthened our marriage. And it turns out that there are more kind of Katies out there among the married public than there are Dans. The American Family Survey tells us that a majority of couples are reporting more appreciation for one another and also a stronger sense of commitment towards their spouse in this year. And that we're seeing also in the survey data that the share of couples reporting that their marriage is in trouble has come down, as this figure here indicates, in 2020. And then finally, when it comes just to the data about marriage and divorce, where we have divorce data available from states reporting divorce trends in real time, what we can see is that in most states, divorce has come down. You know, in states like Florida, Rhode Island, Oregon, and Missouri, divorce is down in 2020 compared to 2019. Now, obviously, I think anyone who kind of thinks about this understands that a lot of this is just about the lockdown. It was hard to get a divorce during the lockdown. But my sense is that given the survey results that I presented just a moment ago, my sense is that divorce will be down in 2020 overall compared to 2019. So, you know, that's partly, I think, the silver lining with COVID. But I also want to say something too about kind of, I think, the changing character, the changing experience of marriage in America, and the way in which I think COVID may reinforce a trend that I think is playing out in American marriages today. So if you kind of think back to the 1970s, I think we saw the rise of a kind of a me first marriage mentality where a lot of people were kind of thinking about marriage as a vehicle for their own individual, their own personal happiness. And this kind of me first mentality was linked to a dramatic increase in divorce in this decade, the 1970s, as we saw with a movie like Kramer versus Kramer, for instance. So what was happening in the 1970s was that we were kind of climbing what might be called Mount Maslow, named after the famous American psychologist. And his idea was that as we were becoming more affluent and more secure, and as the sort of welfare state was becoming stronger, we could afford to focus in a variety of ways more on me first, including in our marriages. We could expect more emotional connection. We could expect more happiness. We could expect more self-actualization in our marriages. And we could discount more classic functions of marriage like kids and economic cooperation and kinship solidarity. That was sort of the thinking. But I think since the 70s, we've seen a shift in marriage for those who are married. Of course, that's a smaller share of Americans, but a shift for those who are married. And that shift, I think, is being kind of augmented now in COVID time. And the point here is that in a world marked by massive economic insecurity, by today record unemployment, by the threat of reoccurring disease, by increases in home production, I think we're kind of taking a different approach to marriage. So the silver lining here is that I think in the face of so much trauma and dislocation, what we're seeing, I think, among those who are married is kind of a deeper sense of our dependence upon our spouse and they upon us, and a recognition too that our kids depend upon us kind of keeping it all together in this time. And I think this is going to be true going forward as well. So I think what we're seeing is, again, for those who are married, and that's a smaller fraction of Americans than used to be the case, but for those who are married, we're seeing the rise of what I would call a family first model of marriage, where marriage is not really about me, it's about a sense of communion with one's spouse. It's about the kids, the children, it's about commitment. It's also about having a decent, steady stream of cash. And it's about kind of being a part of a community that is supportive of your marriage. For many Americans, that's a religious community. For others, it's not. But these 5 C's, I think, mark this family first model of marriage that we're seeing, I think, emerge today, and in some ways augmented by the realities of COVID time. Now, in terms of kind of describing then what's happening in recent years, I think what's going to continue to happen is we're going to see divorce come down. Many Americans think that 1 in 2 marriages today end in divorce, but that's no longer the case because in recent years, particularly since the last Great Recession, divorces come down. So a clear majority of Americans who are marrying today are going to make it. They're going to go the distance. And we're also seeing, partly as a consequence of that, that the share of kids being raised in stable married families is actually increasing, is ticking upwards. And that's, I think, obviously good news from my perspective. Also, too, that, most couples have times of difficulty, frustration, anger, disappointment, in their marriage. That's pretty common for most of us who are married. But on average, most of the time we're doing okay. Most husbands and wives report, as the survey indicates, that they're satisfied. So again, these are some pieces of good news that I think will kind of continue to mark marriages in America today. And so again, to sort of summarize, the good news is that most marriages will go the distance. Most marriages are happy most of the time, and that most kids will be raised in stable married families going forward. So what's the bad news as we kind of close out our conversation, or kind of my formal conversation with you this morning or this afternoon? Well, the bad news is that I think that COVID will augment the economic insecurity that so many Americans have been experiencing in recent years. And that will translate into fewer weddings, to further declines in the marriage rate in America, to the point where more than 30% of young adults today will never marry. I think we're going to see sort of record territory here when it comes to non-marriage. And this pattern of not marrying will be particularly common for poor Americans, for working class Americans, and for Black Americans. So this is sort of one piece, I think, of bad news going forward today in our country. The second piece of bad news is that this economic insecurity will bring the fertility rate even further down to what I would expect would be a record low in 2021, as people become much more cautious about going forward with a family in today's world, which obviously seems so uncertain for so many of us. And then the third, I think, piece of bad news here is you kind of put together the fact that there is less marriage and that there is less fertility, and you're going to have a growing number of Americans who have no kin. In China, they call this sort of the bare branches phenomenon, where adults don't have kin to sort of help them navigate the world that that they live in today. And I think what we're going to see is that many Americans who are kinless are going to face serious difficulties when they're in midlife, and especially late life, in terms of economic security, social support, and their emotional well-being, in this new world. So that's the bad news. And of course, the other point that I would make before I conclude here is that, by contrast, those Americans who are in family first marriages, particularly marked by more commitment to marriage, by decent amounts of cash coming into their household, and by a strong sense of community to sort of help them navigate family life and navigate life more generally, are going to be doing comparatively better than their fellow citizens in the tumultuous times that I think stand in our future. So then our challenge here, to conclude, our challenge is that in post-COVID America, we've got to think about ways to bridge our nation's deep marriage divide and to reverse our falling fertility rate. We need new policies on Capitol Hill, where VJ works, policies that stop penalizing marriage and reward work for ordinary Americans, policies that make it easier to form and sustain strong and stable families for all Americans. But we also have to recognize that what ails the American family isn't going to be cured just by some new policy package in Washington. We're going to have to change the culture as well. Our schools, our media, our pop culture, and yes, even our universities are going to have to be more honest about telling the truth about the family, especially about the ways in which marriage still matters for our kids, our communities, and even for the health of the American dream itself. That's because any successful effort to bridge this family divide will depend not just on public policies, but also upon cultural change. Indeed, that's a central task of the National Marriage Project, kind of just articulating all the ways in which marriage matters for our kids and for our country. So the goal in all of this is not to move backwards to some fabled day in the distant past, but to move forwards towards a nation where the state of our unions is not divided by race and class, and where every American has an equal shot at forging strong and stable families. So thanks for joining me in this conversation. If you'd like more information about the National Marriage Project, you can go to this website. You can also follow me on Twitter at Wilcox NNP. And I'm happy now to kind of turn the conversation over to Chantel and to Vijay to raise some issues with my comments, perhaps, offer their own reflections, and also to kind of raise some questions that that you all have about the state of our unions in America today. So again, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chantel and open up this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. Thank you again for another impactful, engaging, and informative presentation. I'm going to go ahead and transition us into the Q&A section of the presentation, and I'll open up with my own question. Right. So to begin, Dr. Wilcox, what are your thoughts or what research has been done or is being done on policies to bridge this marriage divide that you speak of?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chantal. I think there are a lot of things you could say about policies that would be helpful in bridging this marriage divide in America. And I think two things kind of come to mind in particular as a way of kind of beginning this conversation. One is to eliminate the marriage divide by eliminating the marriage penalty. And so many of our means-tested programs and policies in America today, like Medicaid, for instance, probably that's the most salient policy, end up unintentionally penalizing many working class couples with kids. And the way that it works is if your income falls above a certain threshold, you don't have access to things like Medicaid. And that means that a lot of working class couples end up just having one parent, oftentimes the mom, apply for Medicaid and not get married. In fact, I was talking to a couple here with two beautiful children where he works as an IT rep and she's a stay-at-home mom and they're not married. It's just kind of like probing what's going on here. And they said, well, actually, we sat down at the kitchen table and we ran the numbers and we discovered that if we were to get married, we'd lose access to Medicaid, which covers both the mom and the two kids in this family. So this is an example of how our public policies unintentionally end up hurting many families in the U.S. And I think we need to pursue strategies that would address this penalty. We also need to think about education, I think, in a different way. And this is actually more, Chantel, in some ways your expertise since you're working in a school, as we speak. And what we see in our schools today is that so much of the focus is on kids who are on that college track. And yet we see even in 2020 that a clear majority of young adults, especially men, young men, will not get that four-year degree. So I think we could do more to strengthen vocational education in our high schools and to give a kind of status and dignity to vocational education. And we have seen in a program called Career Academies that young adults from lower income backgrounds, especially, who do career academies are more likely to be flourishing in the economy when they move into jobs and actually have higher marriage rates. So I think trying to think about, efforts to strengthen, in this case, vocational education would be one public policy strategy we could use to bridge this marriage divide in America. So those are two ideas about how we could tackle this issue.
Thanks, Professor Wilcox. And you kind of touched on this question that I'm about to ask in your answer just now. But zooming out from COVID a little bit, no pun intended, it seems there are two broad narratives about what has happened to the American family since the 1960s. One is primarily economic, right? The idea that incentives in federal programs, adverse macroeconomic trends, or even economic disruptions like the current pandemic have contributed to a decline in marriage. And the other is a more cultural story, which argues that our societal norms and expectations toward family life have changed, perhaps irreversibly so. And these narratives aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but they are at least somewhat in tension. So how would you think about the causes of family trends over the last several decades?
Yeah, great question, Vijay. I think, what we hear from the left really is that, family instability, insofar as it's a problem, is primarily a consequence of shifts in the economy. And one of the, I think, more kind of brilliant proponents of this idea is the African-American sociologist William Julius Wilson at Harvard. And he kind of makes the point that there are, in some ways, fewer marriageable men today because today's post-industrial economy is less hospitable to men who don't have that college degree. And I think there's actually a lot of truth to Wilson's perspective. We do see, when we look at job instability, which is a big predictor of not getting married and also of getting divorced, is that job instability has increased dramatically for men in America who don't have college degrees since the 1970s. So I think Wilson is correct that there's something about our economy today that is more difficult for today's men, especially to navigate, men who don't have that, again, that college degree. So I think that's an important perspective to bear in mind. But the culture matters here as well. And actually, the Brookings economist Isabel Sawhill has noted that, in the 1930s, there was obviously, with the Great Depression, tremendous economic insecurity, tremendous unemployment. And yet in the 1930s, there was no dramatic increase in divorce, no dramatic increase in family instability, no dramatic increase in single parenthood, because it was a very different civic and cultural context in the 1930s than what we see today. So what we see today, obviously, is that we live in a cultural world, a civic world, where there are many fewer supports for marriage, many fewer supports for the kind of norms and values and virtues that would sustain a strong and stable family in the face of economic dislocations. So my bottom line here is that it's both changes in the economy and changes in the culture that have made it more difficult for Americans, and again, particularly working class, poor, and African Americans, to enjoy the kind of stable families that they did, say, in 1960. And it's worth underlining this point, and that is that in 1960, there were not big differences by class or by race in American families. And that's in part, I think, because we had a different cultural, civic, and in some ways economic context at that point in our nation's history.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. Now to hop into our live Q&A, I'm going to ask you a question from one of our participants. So here we are. Why does less economic security have to translate to fewer weddings? Millennials' increased interest in sustainability has led to less extravagant weddings to begin with. Has the trend of a potentially societal shift towards less extravagant weddings in the future been considered?
Well, that's a great question. I certainly think one of the silver lining from COVID time is that a lot of people who are getting married this year are doing it on a simpler basis and a cheaper basis. And what some of the research actually suggests is that large but cheap weddings are linked to higher quality, more stable marriages. And so maybe one positive legacy of COVID time is that adults who are getting married in the near future will dispense with the more extravagant weddings that end up putting a huge hole either in their pockets or in their parents' pockets, and really don't have any long-term benefit for them as a couple and their family future. So that, I think, certainly could be one of the benefits of perhaps a different mindset about how we can do weddings going forward. So thanks, Chantal.
Professor Wilcox, you mentioned that you expect divorces to decline in perhaps the short term. One of the questions from our audience is kind of getting at, like, why do you think that is? And is it possible that divorce trends could be down because people can't afford to get divorced during COVID time, or even financial crises more generally? So maybe couples are staying apart or together because they can't afford to be apart.
Yeah, that's a great question. I certainly think that part of the decline in divorce this year is about financial worries. Divorce is expensive in many different ways. Legal fees often means, obviously, selling your house, moving to different, apartments or different homes. And so I think the financial concerns can be quite salient. I also think, too, that the lockdown means that a lot of folks have not gotten a divorce this year that might have otherwise gotten one. And I would predict in 2021, we will see a slight uptick as we see pent-up divorces being expressed in 2021. But my bigger point here is that if the Great Recession is any indication, we saw a decline in divorce during the Great Recession, then a little bit of an uptick in that pent-up demand for divorce, and then a further decline after that. And so we're down more than 20% in the divorce rate since the Great Recession. And so I think kind of coming out of this tumultuous time, we're going to see a further decline overall in the next couple of years in divorce. And again, my perspective is that's going to be driven in part by the fact that I think people are going to often sort of either have the explicit recognition or kind of the implicit sense that in today's world, it's better to have a spouse in your corner, to have your in-laws in your corner, both for you and for your children, than to get divorced. Obviously, there are cases where divorce is necessary and needed, cases involving domestic violence, for instance. But in cases where there's disappointments or a sense that you're kind of maybe growing apart or frustrations, I think what we're going to see is that many couples are going to work through these things and get through that difficult patch in their marriage, recognizing that on balance, the best thing for them and for their kids is to stick together.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. We have another audience member who is interested in hearing about the difference of the impact of having one parent work from home versus both parents. And it seems that having one at home faces more pressures and responsibilities with work and childcare. So just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think today, obviously, with the lockdowns and with many kids being, at home during, the school, the new school routine for many kids today, having, in that case, I think having one parent working outside the home and one seem more difficult, for many couples than having both parents working from home. Haven't seen any research on that, but I would just expect that the sort of obviously the mechanics of a situation where one parent is out of the home, will be more difficult. And in that case, I think, in fact, what I saw with Katie, that woman that I mentioned earlier in the conversation, is they sort of had that conversation a little bit, and they just put together kind of a new routine where they kind of allocated the working time, differently, so that she was working part of the day, and he was taking care of their daughter, and then they flipped. So in a situation where one spouse is working outside the home, I think they might want to sort of change their work hours to make sure that the spouse is working outside the home comes back and takes on the task of caring for the kids, so that the other spouse, can do any professional work that's needed to keep them afloat. So that would be my recommendation, based on part of what Katie and her husband did with a kind of similar situation.
Another audience member asks, so when you're looking at marriage, are you also tracking same-sex marriage? And if so, what do you see with that in these family trends?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vijay. So we are tracking same-sex marriages and same-sex families now. But, to be clear here, right now, at least, less than 1% of married Americans are in same-sex marriages, and fewer than 0.5% of kids among married families are in same-sex married families. So we're kind of tracking these trends, but we don't necessarily have data right now that's really high quality because of the fact that it's a relatively small share of the population, and we're going to be looking at that issue in more detail as we go forward.
All right. And we have another question. So you've mentioned a few times the importance of changes taking place in culture, not just politics. What kinds of cultural changes need to take place to encourage fertility? How do we address a husband-wife team that is leaning against having any children at all, or at most one child?
Okay, that's a tough question. I think part of the challenge facing us today is that I think often the elite culture and the pop culture especially don't really kind of convey the reality of the social science, not just actually on marriage, but even on parenthood. And, you know, there's often this sort of sense that kind of like in the show Friends, that like you're kind of living your best life, you know, in your 20s, for instance, when you're kind of footloose, free and fancy, you know, when you're not married and you have, you know, an opportunity just to kind of, well, hang out, if you will. But what we see is actually for 20-somethings in particular, and for, you know, Americans more generally, is that married Americans tend to do better emotionally and otherwise. And we also see though now when it comes to parenthood, and this is actually a new trend in the data, when it comes to parenthood, we're seeing that parents now are reporting more happiness than non-parents in America. And this is a new thing. It used to be the case that there was a kind of parenthood penalty in the data. And then Americans who had kids were doing less well off on the happiness front than people who were not parents. But that is no longer the case. And that's a whole nother kind of, I think, subject. But I mean, I would just sort of say, as someone who has a lot of kids, that kids are extraordinarily difficult. And Chantel's babysat for my kids. She knows that they can be very difficult at times. But at the same time, I mean, they kind of bring us out of ourselves, you know, and, you know, the experience of gardening with your children, hiking with your children, the experience of swimming with your kids, the experience of, you know, seeing your kids play sports. I mean, these are things that are, you know, awesome and tend to bring us out of our lives and our shells and our homes. And so I think, you know, today, for whatever reason, we're actually seeing that parents are doing better than non-parents. And I don't think that reality has really gotten out to the broader public yet, Chantel, but we need to do a better job of kind of communicating this, this pattern.
Professor Wilcox, in your presentation, you cited a stat about 30% of young people will never marry. And I know just this morning you highlighted research that 40% of Gen Zers will potentially never marry. Do you have insight into how much of this lack of marriage is voluntary versus involuntary?
Yeah, a great question, Vijay. You know, again, he's mentioning that there's a new study out from the University of Michigan by a sociologist named Deirdre Bloom and her colleague, showing really shocking numbers. And it's a projection that may be off. I hope it's going to be off, that just a very large minority of today's Gen Zers will never marry. And I think it's driven by a lot of different things. I think it's driven by economic insecurity. People feel like they don't have access to stable, decent paying jobs, as I mentioned before. I think it's also driven in part by the fact that a lot of young adults feel like there aren't good partners out for them to settle down with. And that's a whole kind of different other issue. I was talking to a young woman in California yesterday, and she was just kind of lamenting the fact that, you know, many of the men that she encounters don't seem to be really kind of capable of commitment. And that's a big frustration that I hear articulated by a lot of younger women today. But I also have to say that there are just tons and tons of articles out there these days in places like the New York Times and the Atlantic that basically are arguing that, you know, marriage doesn't matter, and that, you know, you can get, you know, all the happiness and fulfillment that you'd like to from being, you know, single, from your friends, from your job. And, you know, I'm sorry, but that is just not scientific. And so I think one of the frustrations that I have as, you know, as someone who works in this area is that a lot of the media depictions of, you know, the reality on the ground don't correspond to actually the reality that we're seeing in ordinary Americans' lives. So I think we need to sort of change people's understanding of the actual facts here too, to kind of give them a better perspective on how marriage is linked to better outcomes on average for people.
Right. Dr. Wilcox, one of our audience members has a really great question about the impact on families where kids have special needs.
Yes.
And if there's been any work done or what your general thoughts are.
Yeah, and again, Chantel, just to actually turn it back to you for a second, you're working counseling kids, right?
Yeah.
That's your job. So this is something that you kind of probably have some inside experience on too. But so yeah, I mean, it is the case that, you know, in any family, you know, or there are plenty of families out there today who have kids with special needs. It could be, you know, intellectual disabilities. They could be emotional challenges, other challenges that they're facing. And I think for families who do have kids in the household with special needs of one sort or another, family life is more difficult. It's more challenging. And that puts strains and stresses on the marriage in many cases. And so I think we have to sort of recognize that for those families and for those couples in particular, having a network of friends, of family members, having a community of some sort, could be religious community, could be something else, could be a support group, can be crucial in navigating the challenges of having kids who are struggling or who are difficult in one way or another. And so I think one of the takeaways that I would offer to couples who are struggling with a child or with kids who are doing poorly in one way or another, who are emotionally struggling, is to really seek help out in some kind of group of one sort or another. Because being in the midst of some kind of difficult situation like that is a lot easier when you're talking to other parents who are also struggling, with their family situation or with a particular child.
Another audience question is interesting, looking at the perhaps the international context. Is there an example of a society in which a long-term trend of fewer marriages and or fewer children was reversed?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vijay. I think, we have seen examples Gertrude Himmelfarb, the famous historian in the United States, has written about the way in which in England in the Victorian era, there was a kind of upswing in the share of kids being raised in married families. So there are examples, where that's been the case. We have seen in a number of countries a big decline in fertility in the 1970s, followed by an increase in fertility. We've seen in the U.S. obviously a big increase in marriage and childbearing in the 1950s. So I think in the right context, with the right cultural supports and the right economic supports, we can address the family challenges that I've articulated today. But we have to be, I think, deliberate about doing that. We have to sort of, recognize and appreciate that at the end of the day, a lot of the things that preoccupy our culture and that we focus on in the economy are not as important as sort of what's happening on the domestic front.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have an audience member who's curious about families who have no children. So do you think this will change with the COVID generations as the number of couples without children increase? And what does the research say in general about the quality of marriage of couples who have no children?
Yeah, Sean, that's a good question. So I think we are going to see more couples going forward who are not having kids. And we have seen in a lot of the older research that couples without children, but who are married, were doing a little bit better in their marriages than couples who had kids. Although what's interesting is that, I did one study, for instance, that found that couples with more kids actually were doing better than couples with one child. Although I think that could have been a kind of a selection effect. What I mean by that term is that the kinds of married couples who are kind of selecting to have larger families may be more kind of family oriented in ways that I talked about earlier, today. And that family orientation would also kind of track, I think, oftentimes with being more happily married on average too. But, I think, to be frank, Chantel, I think sort of the link between sort of parenthood and marital quality could be changing. And that's actually a topic that I think would be a great, study to sort of, launch, today, as fertility rates are falling pretty dramatically, and sort of just to sort of see how parenthood tracks with marital quality in 2020 or 2021, and how the family size also is linked to marital quality as well. So great question.
Just to piggyback off this, there's another question that suggests that maybe for couples who are already married, fertility might intuitively be expected to increase due to people spending more time at home. Although I think work by Lyman Stone has suggested that isn't necessarily the case. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think at least right now, that is sort of, in the next year or so, we're going to see even among married couples, younger married couples, the fertility trend, moving downwards, just because I think people are, really cautious about having kids in this crazy context that we're living in right now. I guess the big question is, at the same time, maybe, all that's happened, all that's transpired in the last 7 months and all that's, transpiring right now might change people's kind of sense of like what's relatively important to them. And so maybe there'll be, a little baby boomlet for married people, in 2 or 3 or 4 years from now. But at least in the short term, what Lyman Stone is projecting, as you noted, my colleague, is a decline in childbearing for both unmarried and married Americans as well.
Wonderful. So, Dr. Wilcox, does the success of a child have more to do with parents staying married, or the fact that the parents are more likely to be emotionally stable and skilled in relationships?
Great question, Chantel. One of the things that we see among some family scholars and some journalists writing about family issues is sort of like it's the quality of family life that really matters, not the structure of the family that matters. And, if you look at like individual variables in a statistical analysis of, kids' outcomes, you often will see that the sort of the quality of parent-child relationships is a better predictor of child outcomes than the marital status of parents. So that's an important point to acknowledge. At the same time, we also see too that on average, stably married parents are more likely to give kids the affection, the attention, and the stability that they need to thrive. And so again, on average, when you look at family structure per se, you do find that kids are more likely to flourish in school. They're more likely to steer clear of depression and delinquency when they're hailing from a home with both their married parents, there for them back on the home front.
Professor Wilcox, thank you for all these answers. I think this might be our last question, but just combining a few questions from that people submitted when they registered for this event. What are some practical tips you've gathered either through your research or with conversations with couples tips that you've gathered to pandemic-proof one's marriage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one thing that's important to do, and obviously it's been a lot harder to do these days, is just to kind of spend time away from your spouse and your kids if possible. And amidst the lockdowns, obviously it was really hard for all of us. So, if heaven forbid the lockdowns come back this winter, I think that means doing things like, getting out for, walks or runs or other forms of exercise outside of the home. But for many of us who can now see friends, preferably obviously outside in relatively well ventilated situations, it also means kind of getting out and seeing friends and doing other things to kind of just sort of clear the air. I think that's always a good thing. A second thing that I would say though too is just kind of trying not to lose sight of sort of the long-term horizon, the long-term perspective. Recognizing that in any given particular moment in your marriage or your family life, things can take a downward turn, and that's a natural thing. But that, I think that the challenge is just to recognize that for most of us, kind of sticking with our spouse is the best thing for us and especially for our children. And so just having that long-term perspective in mind when, your spouse is making you go crazy and you're frustrated or you're disappointed or otherwise, upset. I think it's important to have that longer-term perspective, both in general and in COVID time in particular.
Wonderful. Dr. Wilcox, thank you so much for your time, expertise, and insight. We all really appreciate it. I did want to give you an opportunity to give any final thoughts if you had any.
Yeah, I think the only final thought that I would have in terms of this general topic is that, I think it's important, again, I think we all are kind of aware of some of the bad news about marriage in America today. And we often see in the pop culture, like there was this movie, The Marriage Story, for instance, that offer a very negative depiction of family life on Netflix. It was a popular show on Netflix, for instance. And there are obviously clear concerns that I've articulated today, but I just want to sort of end, right now on a more hopeful note. And that is that, again, for Americans who are getting married today, and that's a smaller group of Americans, but for those who are doing that, I think I've got some good news to share. And that is that most of those folks will not get divorced, at least on current trends, and that most of the kids who are being, born today or about, raised today are going to be raised by their unstably married parents. And so those are kind of two pieces of good news not to lose sight of today. And I think that those two trends will be true also going forward, even in sort of COVID time.
Wonderful. And thank you all to all of our audience members. Thank you so much for your contributions and for your engagement today. I'm going to hand it back over to Maggie Welsh.
Thank you all so much, and thanks for joining us. We will send a follow-up email with the recording of this event. Please feel free to share it, and thanks for joining us today, and join us for future events. Thanks to VJ and Chantal and to Professor Wilcox for their time. Have a good day.